guy online like Tom Wetzel. It he basically locates the logic of reality outside of, well, I mean, outside of us. And so like reality is just sort of like, I don't know. It's muddled. I couldn't even recite it if I tried. But what you were saying about like how the guy was trying to separate the end of oppression with class abolition, even though they're both of those determinations are coextensive, right? He was trying to analytically separate them in the same way as some of the people tried to treat number as a notion when, or or maybe it's vice versa, I forget. It's like, never mind, I lost it. But the idea that like using number is a purely external exercise from this chapter really made an impression on me because I mean, it's us just picking up symbols and starting to manipulate them, but in and of themselves they're, either units or amounts, exactly as he says.
Yeah.
And I don't know any more from there. So Kyle, this is your baby. This is
Okay. I did like how there are like two definitions of quantitative one we have to go through. All
yeah.
right. Well, let me actually probably bring up my obsidian instead. So I had to go back through to start to kind of remember where we got to when it came to quantum, because it came from both discrete and continuous magnitude. But in going through the process of going of seeing how they in their difference rather than they did in their similarities.
Yeah.
Uh, where did I get that? Going through that, we find that in the okay, let me just go through this very quick because
Yeah, go ahead. Take your time.
uh, we find that, of course, in this sense, they're both a determinate, two different aspects of a determinate being, kind of it paralleling reality negation because it's basically the same track. It's determinate being as both, something and its opposite. Um, in this sense, when we go through that, is that it when we get to the limit on this side, it is interesting in that it is specifically that it is discrete magnitude is one that pushes the limit onto constant into a continuous magnitude. There's no two directions. So you have one as the active limiter and you have one that is passively limited. But in and just to kind of quickly summarize, you go through both processes, you find they end up still forming the same kind of quanta in the way you have to divvy it up. It's just that one creates the limit, one doesn't. Um, this is because the discrete magnitude itself is discontinuous by definition. But even, and of course, that's how it creates quanta. Discrete creates a limit, of course, then other discrete outside of that magnitude itself creates its own limit as well, et cetera, et cetera. Continuous is just limited itself by discrete magnitude. So that is how it creates its own limits. But by going through that process, they both fall into being the same quanta. Gives us okay. So now that I'm here, that kind of helped me a bit. We just he started looking ahead, and right now we're going to focus on extensive quantum, which is just just sort of the kind of it's in front of us. Anything else, and eventually we get to an intensive quantum, which is or just degree, which is in itself, and then quantitative infinity. So that's looking ahead. For now, quantum. We find that quantum at this point is just seems to be a pure, in when it's just in this kind of discrete form, it is just a unit, right? So it's got the property of the one, It's not yet the number one.
Mm-hmm.
We're not there yet. It
Right.
is, as a unit, it's purely self-relating. As it's limited, it's exclusive. And the fact that it still contains many ones is the same one, it's an enclosure. And so those are the three kind of properties of number that of quanta that makes it, what it is. Although through this process, then you think about the enclosure, and of course, the enclosure can and how many units are in it. That itself then becomes an amount, right? So
Like
the
a
first,
hundred.
yeah, like the 100. So the first thing we see that in a grouping, we 2 units, we see 2, 3, 3, etc. Of course, one interesting thing is at this point we still don't see 1 as a number. This is interesting thing I read from Hegel is because he had to go to philosophy of history to find Hegel's understanding of the number 1 and how it's derived.
Yeah.
In order to find the number 1, you actually have to subtract, and so you get an amount that's 1. You don't start off with that. And of
Hmm.
course, then that is then how you're able to derive the number 0 through that same process, and then you get to -1, -2, etc.
Hmm.
It is essentially like a sublation. So you have the counting numbers in a way, excluding 1, and then you can derive the rest of the numbers.
I noticed in the logic the way that he presents it in like in remark one, he basically says the number and how it's used is external. So he doesn't spend a whole lot of time on the derivation of the numbers,
Mhm.
just that it's like you have unit and amount, and the way that numbers are used are entirely external and applied to real world
Right.
objects or calculation. And thus, we don't spend much time, at least at that initial point, on like the building blocks of number because it's I don't know. It's
Pretty
more of a
big.
it's more of a historical determination, just like you said,
Mhm.
uh, kind of in the same way that Marx determines that um, like use value is a historical determination in capital. So he spends like a sentence on it and then blows it off for the more quantitative and you know the yeah the stuff that actually applies to his argument is what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do. What was it? I do like this point. It's kind of. I think it was Holge that pointed out more explicitly, but I think Hegel kind of leans into that because all these numbers interrelate externally to each other because they're all kind of grouped in this by the amount.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then since the underlying principle for here has been speculatively derived, it's kind of its own, we're able to see what it is. Yeah, do your own thing, mathematics.
Right.
Do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, and the thing I really liked too was he split off between like if you're looking at a line or a triangle or a circle,
Right.
there are two different ways to look at it. You can look at it as like how big the circle is, and then you're measuring it. But if you're just talking about a circle in general and its general geometrical shape, it's it's a very um
It has to do with difference.
it's a very different and I don't want to say qualitative, but yeah, kind of like
It gets
um
between two different things. You have to kind of have some kind of measure at that level. Not measure maybe necessarily as we get to it in the logic, but still.
well hang on a second because uh
Because it does have a spatial component to it that you don't get in a just a number itself.
yeah so okay yeah here it is and I'm just going to read it out because it's really cool. Spatial magnitude and numerical magnitude are usually regarded as two species, the former being on its own account a determinate magnitude just as much as the latter. uh Um, spatial magnitude possesses only limitation generally. If it is to be considered as a thoroughly determinate quantum, then number is required. Geometry as such does not measure spatial figures. It is not mensuration, but only compares them. In its definitions, too, the determinations are in part derived from the equality of the sides and angles or from equidistance, right? So it doesn't matter how big or small, it's all about comparisons, right? Thus, the circle, because it is based solely on the equidistance of all possible points in it from a center, does not require number for its determination. These
That's
determinations based on equality or inequality are genuinely geometrical.
that's what I was meaning. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the difference, but it is at a comparison level. Okay.
Yeah, it's not numeric. Now you could add a number on there, but then you
Yeah.
moved on to measuring how big or small, how much volume something has, but as just a figure, like all circles are basically equal. All triangles are all equilateral triangles, or if you have an isosceles might bring in measure because
I was trying to remember.
that
Was it
third
just
side.
was it just me, or is it Holgate that came out like kind of like geometry itself is a other determination later that comes up rather than anything that's used that is possible. Well, I mean, it's spatial figure, all that. So of course it's later determination because you have to have space at that point.
Right, and that's part of the philosophy of nature, and I
Right.
yeah he differentiates the higher form, which is spatial, from just simply the quantum, and what the quantum uh, um, consists of, and what it does and how it's used, and he spends an awful lot of time basically talking about how it's used in a wholly external way because that's what it signifies in the that's how it's used in the outside world. Um, and it's interesting, like my question is like, can you make this distinction with every single category? And I don't think you can, because some things are used explicitly externally, while others are like taken for like being is taken for granted externally. Like we have being, but we don't spend very much time on the is or the was. The way Hegel delineates the determinations, but with quantity, um, you know, how it's made up logically as opposed to how it's used externally are two different questions.
All
Interrelated, of course, but
right.
because if it wasn't logically determined, the quantum wasn't logically determined the way it was, we couldn't use it the way that we do. And I mean, Pythagoras, for instance, seems to have made almost a religion out of um, mathematics and comparisons of line lengths. Uh, gave us the Pythagorean theorem, of course. And it's interesting because when you're in school and they teach it to you, they don't always give you like the full history and why everything is why triangles are used to measure like objects the way that they are. They just kind of say memorize this and we'll use it in class and you'll do your worksheet and then you go home and not worry about it. But I'm pretty sure it wasn't always taught that way. Uh,
Memorize multiplication tables. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean he even says, there are addition and multiplication tables, and you have to learn it by rote. And there are ways to do it faster, but I mean our society uh, uh, values us, getting to the cash register and totting up someone's order. So we're given all that they think we need, however you want to say that.
All right. Yeah, Jim, are you back in?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think what I want to do next is before I go into anything about his digression into Kant, is he just kind of goes through the process of the three steps of arithmetic or three types of arithmetic methods that are described in school. And I just want to briefly say technically, because I looked into it, they have derived further determinations beyond just these three. They just again are based again, it's based on them, blah blah blah. They have like no use that they found in yeah, so it's purely an abstraction in mathematics that they drive it that they play around with. So the first one, the most basic one, is addition, which is just pretty much, you have your one number already, then you add it to another number with the same units, and they're pretty much just those two units slowly counted, or you can see it as slowly counted or just regrouped into one, and now it's just another enclosure of that, and that number of units is going to be that amount. Then in a kind of simplification of that process, when the number itself is added multiple times, so it's like 3 plus 3 plus 3, that can be brought together as like three groups of three in that sense. So that then how did he describe it exactly? I lost that picture. Oh, okay, that's right, because it changes the units. So at that point, you have the number 3, but then you have the unit representing 3. But eventually, of course, that breaks down into the numbers below it, which is just addition again. So you eventually get back to number 9. To go from there, I forget how he puts that here together, because I didn't get his description pretty well. That the further equality is that the unit and amount themselves, with the advance of equality of determinations on the basis of this complete equality, counting is the raising to a power. I think at this point they're kind of so immediate respect to each other, so therefore simply unequal. So it's, I guess, in a way that they are both unit and amount of two numbers together, but yeah, I guess from our perspective, we know that's just sort of multiplying the same number again multiple times is shown in exponentiation, which of course, like 3 to the power of 2 is just 3 times 3. Again, that's 9.
Yep, it's all related.
Yeah. And then, of course, you can repeat that abstractly over and over. And that's what I mentioned before. The next step, because that's the third level. So fourth level is just called tetration. So 4, it's just the exponentiation multiple times to itself. And then there's pentation, etc. Wikipedia ended at pentation and just mentioned the next one.
Yeah.
So, and at that point, you get to like the bad infinity, but it does exist, right? But that just kind of goes over logically, which we kind of already knew roughly. A lot of us, I know that this is how I pictured it in my head how that works. It's just that going into that to kind of explain, oh, this is how you can actually explain each of these arithmetic operations works. I'm trying to remember. He went to Kant. That's his proposition about addition. Here is that. Yeah, I can't really remember really this point, but basically Kant ends up deriving somehow that this 7 plus 5 equals 12 is determined a priori in our head synthetically, because it's kind of how the numbers get derived. But in the end, remember, we straight up are able to kind of show how it's just units connected together externally and in their amount, et cetera, that they come together. So, yeah.
Yeah. He actually gives Kant a lot of credit.
Yeah.
Here,
that one sec.
Yeah, he says
There it is. Yeah. Kant's
Yeah,
notion of synthetic a priori judgments, the notion of something differentiated with equally is inseparable of an identity, which in its own self is an inseparable difference, belongs to what is great and imperishable in his philosophy. Of course, this notion is also present in intuition, since it is the notion itself and everything is implicitly the notion, but the determinations selected in those examples do not exhibit it.
yeah.
The
And so,
contrary, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead. Yeah,
Oh, on the contrary, number and counting is an identity in the creating of an identity which is wholly and solely external, only a superficial synthesis, a unity of ones which are, in fact, posited as inherently not identical with one another, but as external, each separate on its own accounts. The determination of the straight line as being the shortest between 2 points is based rather on the moment of merely abstract identity possessing no difference within itself.
yeah. It like that line could express the shortest different distance, but then then you're bringing up a spatial determination, and how long is that spatial determination? Short, long, what? It could be halfway around the globe. It could be from your backyard to your driveway, right? And and so you sort of regress into like future determinations of spatial difference, which are like
Right. That's where he goes into where geometry is synthetic. It's like
there's another thing I liked, and I'm trying to remember it, but I just forgot.
I don't remember if there's anything else either because I have
Now
nothing
there's
else in my notes.
now there's definitely one other thing, and I'm sure I can find it in the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, I didn't get to complete where I wanted at Holgate, but yeah, and I guess again he goes back into the fun thing where Pythagoras assigned value like a concept to each number that's somehow embodied.
Question is how does Hegel's philosophy of number compares to philosophies of number like from Frege or from Russell? I think Holgate actually isn't Holgate somewhere right about that.
There is like, let me see here. I think there's about 100 pages on that
Yeah.
that he wrote, 3 different chapters. I mean, I'm trying to remember. He does go into it partially in the latest podcast he was on, but I don't remember, unfortunately, much from it at the moment. Fregel's definition of
I got it. The other interesting part, and I can't remember where it is, but I remember the word. He actually starts talking about um, what a contingent is, as opposed to a necessity. I mean, he doesn't really contrast it with a necessity, but he says that the something is contingent, like the way the numbers are used are arbitrary and contingent, and he introduces that in such a way that, I mean, if you've read some of the philosophy of nature, you know that nature contains both necessity and contingency, and um, uh, the external expression of number uh, falls more under contingency than um, necessarily necessity. Like there's only so far you can go with the necessity, like the building blocks of what makes up numbers and the numbering system, etc. But the actual operations are all contingent. They're all whatever you're measuring, your computer screen, your lamp, your dinner. It's wholly in the external space. Oh, and I like this. So yeah. Kyle, what you were saying about Kant using 7 plus 5 equals 12, right? I really like this because he says the concept of the sum means nothing more than the abstract determination that these two numbers are meant to be aggregated, and as numbers in an external, that is mechanical fashion. And then he uses the German word. And the German word is different from the English word because he uses mechanical for the translation, right? And this brings a whole different picture to my head than the German, which is Begriffslose. Begriffslose is concept-less. It means concept-less. So notion-less, right? So if you read it like the concept of the sum, concept, means nothing more than the abstract determination that these two numbers are meant to be aggregated, and as numbers as in external, that is concept-less fashion that we are to count on from 7 until the ones to be added on have been exhausted. The result bears the otherwise familiar name of 12. And then he goes on to talk about how Kant tries to make concepts or a concept of this synthetic operation when actually it's simply mechanical and notionless, right? We're working in the universe of the notion. Remember, I found that really like telling, how he puts it that way. Begriffslose.
Also, I guess the one thing I see that Holgate, by the way, for Jim, that mentioned about Frege, he definitely sees Frege as a philosopher of understanding because he, in fact, holds fixed oppositions. So that definitely is a big starting point of difference there.
Yeah. And further down, he says, with the thinking of the sum, with the analysis of the concept, and keep that word analysis in your mind, right? The transition from the problem to the result has, of course, nothing whatever to do. And he adds, we must go outside these concepts and have recourse to intuition, to our 5 fingers and so on. That's adding the concept and blah, 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 right? So when you're talking about logic and logical determinations, that are connected together by thought, and on the other hand, analytical determinations. I think this could give some insight into Marx's determination of capital and this sort of analytic discursive approach that modern so-called Marxists try to bring to bear numerically or otherwise to sociological problems. And you can see exactly with that how different they are, because everything is sort of arbitrarily, contingently put together based on what you think is related. They may or may not be logically involved, which is how G.A. Cohen, as Doug found when he read some of G.A. Cohen's stuff, does with the problems of capital. He doesn't take it in a logical fashion. He takes it in an external, here's how I think you should do it, and it's my rough hack, and I think it's the way Marx did it. Unfortunately, he's wrong because Marx took the logical approach following Hegel. Take it away, Doug. Oh yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you have anything to say about G.A. Cohen or any of the way that he put it.
Just that he's garbage. I really don't have much to say beyond that. He's one of the, he rips the philosophy out. He puts it with this language mumbo jumbo. And he basically takes the Second International caricature that I was always essentially taught to reject as fake Marxism as the genuine Marxism. And then he just gets rid of that after the fall of the Soviet Union and goes back to religion. So I don't really see the value of this man or any of his work or anything from analytical Marxism.
At
I mean,
that point,
thankfully,
pragmatism.
sorry, I'm not really offering a cogent critique beyond the article I wrote. I just really detest everything associated with that
Well,
school.
Well, actually, I think it's very cogent because what you just described could otherwise be described as pragmatism. He just sort of did what he wanted, and when the environment changed, I mean, he threw the cards up in the air. So it's rank opportunism, and it's baked into the Second International Code, as far as I'm concerned. Circumstances change, and I don't know.
I mean, it's interesting with Cohen, his background was actually in the Canadian Communist Party when he was much younger. And so he's it's kind of natural to accept that kind of stagism for both Stalinism and also social democracy. So
Yeah.
there really isn't much of a shift with him, to do that. And I believe when he spent time, I believe, in Britain, and he was, I think, in and out of the Labour Party like a lot of people. So
I think he was also in the Communist Party a bit too.
Okay, so again, like I said, in and out of the Labour Party because they were too.
Yeah.
But yeah, in his day-to-day practice, it really wasn't super radical. That's not, I'm more going to condemn him for his writings than what he did day to day. But, he's part, I think, how do I put this? Like, obviously, he's taking inspiration from Althusser on the rejection of Hegel in Marxism. And once you kind of get rid of that philosophy, you're kind of left with, like, it's just very arbitrary what you do. Althusser kind of paves the way for post-Marxism, for postmodernism. Obviously, it's not him alone. There's wider societal shifts. But with Cohen and his whole crew, he sort of tries to maintain some kind of allegiance to socialism until he dies. But since he denies any material necessity for it because his philosophy doesn't allow it, he's just reduced to empty moralism. And the other analytical Marxists just sound like they could be like stockbrokers or something, or they could be members of the Chinese Communist Party, which is to say just stockbrokers in China.
Like Eric Olin Wright.
I'm not sure if Eric Olin Wright. Yeah, he was. What am I talking about? Can't think. Sorry, too late.
It's interesting too because
I'm thinking of John Romer, who's like the real big, he's like, I don't even know why he even called himself a Marxist.
Wright talks about class too, which I find extremely ironic, considering that class, you would think, militates against the analytic tradition.
He's got a lot of like sociological writings on it. The person who I think who did the best kind of dissection of Wright, who I haven't read much beyond his How to Be a Marxist in the 21st Century. The book sucks, by the way. Is Raju Das, and it's like, what is it, Class Theory for a Critical World. I have my copy. It's
long.
It's long, and Das could have actually used a good editor, but I think his conclusions are all on point. I wouldn't want to read that book again, though. Even though I think he's like politically on the money, it's just like, I don't want to read that again.
Yeah.
You're right. He was someone who started off as an Althusserian before he became an analytical Marxist. So,
well, that would track then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to read this really quick because I think it's very helpful. It's at the bottom of page 211, where he kind of sums up before going into the next remark. He says, and it's to your point too, Kyle, what you mentioned. It says, it cannot be said that the progressive determination of the species of calculation here, given is a philosophy of them, or that it exhibits possibly their inner significance. And for this reason, that it is not, in fact, an imminent development of the notion. Okay. However, philosophy must be able to distinguish what is an intrinsically self-external material, like the number, right? The progressive determining of it by the notion can then take place only in an external manner, and in its moments too, can be only in the form peculiar to their externality, as here, equality and inequality. It is an essential requirement when philosophizing about real objects to distinguish those spheres to which a specific form of the notion belongs, that is, spheres in which the notion has an actual existence. Otherwise, the peculiar nature of a subject matter which is external and contingent, like that in nature, right, will be distorted by ideas, and similarly, these ideas will be distorted and made into something merely formal. I think he's talking about Platonism or Neoplatonism a little bit, but not exactly naming it entirely. But here, the externality in which the moments of the notion appear in this external material calculation, in other words, number is the appropriate form. Since these moments exhibit the subject matter in its fixed differences, and since too they contain no demand for speculative thinking and therefore appear easy, they deserve to be employed in textbooks of the elements.
That's what it was.
And then remark two, he gets into why, if you try to turn these number systems into a philosophic notion, it falls flat on its face or looks just wrong, right? And that'll be remark two for next time.
I don't know if this relates to anything, but I was reading a bit of Alain Badiou's Being an Event about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And his whole basis for ontology is basically mathematical set theory. And to be fair to Badiou, like, Being an Event is not an easy work, and there are other works where he does try to explain the philosophy. But what gets me when I was reading it is, again, I don't know if this relates, because I can barely understand anything in this chapter, is he's very clear openly that he's just choosing this set theory. There's no logical reason why he picks this as opposed to something else.
Yeah.
He picks it, he decides it. It's very decisionistic. And it's like, has everyone here seen...
It's arbitrary. It's
yeah, has everyone here seen Shawshank Redemption? Otherwise, my joke. I don't want to spoil the movie.
I've seen it.
Okay, anyhow. It's like, you've seen Shawshank Redemption, and you know how it ends, so you watch the movie and you kind of appreciate it. And it's also like if you see a movie with a blooper, and you can never unsee it. So it's like, Badiou's like this pretty major continental philosopher, like Verso publishes his books and everything. And I can't unsee the fact that his whole philosophy is based on an arbitrary decision. And unlike the Shawshank Redemption, where you appreciate certain scenes in the movie more once you know the ending, once you know that Badiou is kind of just decided, you really can't take it seriously. I'm like, you're building up this whole edifice on mathematics, on set theory, about where events come from, where situations come from, where truth comes from. And it's not based on anything logical to me. It's just based on, I just kind of want to do this.
You want to send that to me? Maybe I could.
It sounds like a branch maybe of statistics, like you look at the statistical deals and then you can...
I mean, he's basing it on set theory like Cantor.
I mean, like,
and he's also drawing from Lacan as well. And he's got an interesting pass among French Maoism. Although I don't think there's anything remotely Marxist, Leninist, or Maoist in Being an Event. Some of his earlier works, he's kind of playing with mathematics, but he's still operating within some at least semi-Marxist framework.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know if this relates to anything, but just whenever I think of like ontology and math, you know, I'm thinking of Badiou. Like, I've tried to read that book a few times, and I might try and plow through a little more, but it's so, once you get that arbitrary decision, it's like there's nothing that logically why we choose that. It's like it's one thing to say I'm choosing this because of based on reasons A, B, C, and D. If I'm just choosing it because I want to, it's like I don't know.
Yeah, the number and how it's derived logically, right? Almost as a qualitative, well, I'm not going to say a qualitative quantity, but as a determinate being of quantity, right? And that determinate being of quantity is externalized in number. In other words, it's used in the real world to um, to count, like he says, to count, to calculate, and even to measure with the numbers based on different, you know, numeric. Like Marx talks about how there's a weight. Like on the first page, he talks about there are different numbering systems, weight systems, to weigh your bread or weigh gold or do all of these other things, right? And how you know, just that's sort of how you measure something's use value based on weight or how much there is, 50 beets, 100 potatoes, etc. And so there's the logical determination of the number, and then there's how it's used externally. And he's basically saying you can't mistake one for the other, or you fall into like such a horrible trap, you know. And the way he brings out what's necessary and determinate about a number, like one and the many, from the previous determinations, versus the species of calculation and how they cannot be a philosophy in and of themselves because they don't hang together, you know. Numbers can be used externally to do all kinds of things in the real world, but there's no logical determination between point A and point B of where you're going to use it. One day you're at the store calculating your grocery bill, and the next day you're walking the field and trying to see how many paces long the field is by wide, right? And how are those two events, to use Badiou's uh, language, related, right? Can you relate those two events with set theory? They're so arbitrary and
It's arbitrary, and the thing
depend
is,
on,
like,
person to person. Like one guy's a farmer, another guy's like a banker, and he'll never go near that field, right? And so, how can you determine, the different uses? You can't. It's wholly external. There's nothing logically necessary about
that's
the
what I
order.
feel what Badu thinks an event is like a rupture with the situation. It's something that's part of the set that can't be counted. I'm probably not understanding some of the specifics correctly, but to put it bluntly, I think it's just basically religion wrapped up in mathematics because the event, like he considers, say, revolutions to be events, politics, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, or whatever. And he also says like art and love, and I think science is the other one. But it's like there's no way for revolutions, for instance, just to take that one. With Baidu, it's like, okay, it's like, how do you determine how this happens? And it almost appears like a miracle out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And, you know,
If
when you
if
like when you
if I were
use like the logical categories of Hegel, as applied by Marx, you can understand the material necessity of capitalism, of the proletariat, and the contradictions that eventually give you crisis breakdown, a revolutionary situation. It's something that can be rationally understood. And we may not be able to predict the exact minute or second the revolution happens, but we can understand the contradictions that lead to it. With Badu, it's just like it just happens. It's like, God appearing before Paul or Jesus appearing before Paul on the road to Damascus, and he goes out to convert. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that one of Badu's actually better books is actually a study of St. Paul to explain his philosophy.
That's right. Yes.
It's actually a very well-written book. I do recommend it.
I've read the book. It's great.
Yeah, it's a great book. If I wasn't like a very stone-hearted atheist, I probably, it might convert me. But
Yeah.
But anyhow, it's just like there's nothing. I think in Badu's system, it's not materially based. I don't think it's like actually very rational. And I just don't. It's like I would like to actually see the argument for why we should have an ontology based on set theory.
This
but
is
he doesn't
be-
give it to me. He just decides it and then builds
Uh,
from that.
What you described, as sort of like the religion, uh, love and feeling, like it really brings into focus for me what Badou's basic problem is. So it sounds like he is trying to mix and match the categories of spirit with the categories of the logic. To put it in a real general way, he's trying to say that events that happen in spirit can be logically yes, just one. I'll be right back.
but this is being an event, right, Doug?
Yes, being an event, the first he's got 3 big books in the Being an Event trilogy. There's Logics of Worlds, and then there's Eminence of Truths.
I saw that he derives being from the one and many.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
I think a theoretically more interesting book is that he wrote in the 70s or no, early 80s called Theory of the Subject. Because again, he's still kind of operating in some form of Marxism there. But Being an Event is yeah, that's a fun book.
of
Well,
course,
as far as using set theory in philosophy, that's something a lot of analytical philosophers have been doing for the past 100 years or so.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Using set theory to do philosophy. And that's something that a lot of analytical philosophers have been doing for the past century or so.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure it's where Bud you got the idea from, but
so what was the book you recommend? Theory of the Subject. There it is.
Yeah, Theory of the Subject I thought was a bit more interesting. There's still a too much math in it, but it's
Oh,
he's also written a lot of, he's actually a very diverse writer.
right.
Like he's written some interesting like historical essays, polemics and everything. I disagree with almost all of it, but he's
I
not
haven't,
just that some of it's much more accessible. Like the book Ethics that he wrote is actually fairly accessible.
Doug. It's in the title.
Thinking because I about to say
What-
I had to do
Doug,
set theory in college, so
Doug, what's the title of his book that we've been talking about?
Being an Event.
Yes.
Yeah.
Being is a category of the logic, and you can logically derive it. Event is, if you look at the way the phenomenology is laid out, event is, almost a pseudo category of spirit. Like, can you with set theory determine when Napoleon's going to break out and start conquering pieces of Germany, or when the French Revolution is going to happen?
No, you
No,
can't.
absolutely not. But he's saying somehow that you can, and that is the fundamental flaw, I think, is that he thinks he can sort of like have both worlds and make them make sense by squaring them or taking a rough center hack. I haven't read the book, so I don't know how. But it's astonishing that has passed for serious philosophy. My God.
I mean, I'm slightly embarrassed to say about 10 years ago I was big into it. I never like bought into like the set theory stuff, but I was big into Badiou. I thought, oh, this is the next big thing. He's got a lot of insights. But the more I've tried to like really read up on philosophy between Spinoza and Hegel, it's like you don't see what the fuss is about.
how do I use this set theory?
A lot of these folks, like I don't even know what their motivation is to do these things. I'm sure if I read the book, I'd have a better insight. But the whole of philosophy after Schelling came in and tried to scotch
Yeah, here it is.
Hegel's system, is like uh, an attempt to make neo-Kantianism the the primary way of philosophizing. And the problem with that, of course, is Kant came in and said philosophy's over, right? For the most part. And there's a big gulf between intuition and what actually is, and too bad, you know. And here's Badiou coming in and saying, yes, but with intuition we can make guesses and put them into sets, and then we can make guesses about reality. This is like the opposite of determination and notion. It's a neo-Kantianism, as far as I can tell. It's a way of bridging the gulf with mathematics, instead of the way Hegel did it, which is to say there was no gulf to begin with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it seems to be based. The reason he brings set theory, and it looks like it's a way to solve the division of the one and the many.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, he's also
it's
he actually
duality with a bridge.
Yeah, he's also big into, he doesn't like the idea of the one, actually. He's really takes up the Maoist notion that one divides into two and it's like this permanent struggle.
Yeah. Interesting.
Like
yeah,
I shared some quotes on it
to,
on my wall a few weeks ago.
Yeah,
but yeah.
He's a dualist to the hilt.
Oh yeah, he's also very like Ishe Landa, who has gone off the deep end with his politics. He wrote a good essay on Badiou, where he's kind of looking at some of the Nietzschean themes in him.
Yeah.
The other guy I liked actually on Badiou was much earlier, was Daniel Benseed, who is a French Trotskyist, and he wrote a short essay on Badiou.
Yeah.
But I don't want to like there's stuff like essays of his that are like worth checking out. I don't think his overall philosophy is any good though.
Oh, I
would actually like to
like
see his.
read.
I would like to see, because it was supposed to come out at one point. He had a bunch of major writings when he was like a leading Maoist intellectual from the 70s that were supposed to be in English, and they've never been released. And I'd like to read those because he's probably actually made more interesting contributions to me in that material, because he's still operating in some parameters of Marxism.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting sociological material in 20th century Marxism that gets, that goes of the dualist variety. But you also have to keep in mind that every time that these people try to systematize whatever they're talking about, it just falls flat on its face because of the dualism.
Yeah, I mean, you have Austrian Marxism, who were big into Kant, or big in combining Kant and Marx anyway. I mean, I actually don't think it's an accident that their philosophy leads to political betrayal, actually, but that's a whole other story.
Well, some of the Austro-Marxists were followers of Ernst Mach, but Ernst Mach was someone who had started off as a neo-Kantian anyway. And many of the logical positivists were original neo-Kantians, and where they broke with Kant was over synthetic a priori, which they rejected. So it's all neo-Kantianism, all the way. All these people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean what Hegel says is true. Like he does get the determination of synthetic a priori right. He just doesn't know how to use it, and I don't think his point was to like develop how to use it. So somewhere in Houlgate basically says, yes, he says this is the case, but I'm not going to really dwell on it much because it would take a much bigger work to deal with that problem. And of course, Hegel takes up that cudgel and says, science of logic, and here's my proof: the phenomenology of spirit, a direct application of logically derived being, and from being to the absolute, applied to something, consciousness. You look how spare, you look how I mean, we say this about capital too. You look how spare the determinations that are derived are with any subject. Like philosophy of right starts with property and ends with, I haven't gotten to the end, so I don't know. But there's an absolute of the philosophy of right. I guess it's the state. No, because there's state and civil society. I don't know, but you get what I mean, right? I mean, he's not trying to create a unified theory of everything, right? Even his subjects are really narrowly defined, and he believes, based on the evidence, you know, you read his books, that the way of scientific investigation, if it's to proceed in the way that he outlined, is exactly the way that Marx took it up. You know, you have the commodity and you end up with, you know, the whole capitalist system, but defined categorically in its necessity. In its external forms, as we know, they change and they turn into other things, but you know, the quantity wouldn't have turned over into quality yet until, you know, we get to the revolution and overturn into communism. And one of the ways that you know that it isn't just arbitrary that Marx basically defines communism in that way is that what other material are you going to derive the overturning from quantity to quality on, right? It's not exactly like I'm just going to choose what I like, you know, like some libertarian, right? There are only so many elements that you're dealing with in the makeup of capitalist society. What are the elements, right? Those are the only things you can choose from. How are they logically involved? What necessitates another thing, right? This is how the proletarian as the class or category is found out as the one that's going to overturn it, not just some random, you know, wish list or whatever it is. It kind of makes the history of oppression and resistance. You know, you could almost cast it as a sort of like blind groping in some places. You know, like with the Narodniks, they're sort of blindly groping for the right formula, and this is after Marx wrote Capital, right? I don't know how aware they were of Capital.
Some of them were aware, but Marxism doesn't take off until the 1880s with Plekhanov.
Right.
There's a reason he's called the father of Russian Marxism.
Yeah, and before then they were just sort of like, you know,
And
you know, before then it's like Shays Rebellion. You know, stuff kicks off, and it's not exactly all that well organized, but it's significant.
yeah, and again, Marx was in contact with some of them. He had great respect for a lot of them. And yeah, with Plekhanov, he is actually, until, you know, for a long time, he actually plays almost like an Engels type role. People are getting their Marxism both through Marx and Engels, obviously, but also through Plekhanov, who's engaged in all these polemics with the Narodniks. And also he does something most people in the Second International don't do, which is elaborate on Marxist philosophy. Like, he understands Hegel far more than I think someone like Kautsky does, or certainly like anyone in France. And there's a reason, even after, you know, Plekhanov becomes a traitor, Lenin says, you know, you can't be a communist unless you work through Plekhanov. And Trotsky just agrees with that, you know. And, you know, the more I've read on like Plekhanov, you know, on like a lot of philosophy, I think that's true.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's one of my criticisms of Lars Lee that in making Kautsky like this towering figure over Lenin, he kind of like ignores the fact that this guy Yeah, he obviously is influenced by Kautsky, but he's influenced by a lot of other people too. And I could make a far better case for Plekhanov than Kautsky.
Well,
But
Plekhanov was
that's
more hands-on than Kautsky in the Russian sense. Why would Lee ignore that? I mean, come on.
yeah, he doesn't. It's a very myopic view. Again, if all he was doing is saying that Kautsky influenced Lenin, no one disagrees with that. I don't disagree with that. It's just like he makes it overpowering and he makes Lenin just a Kautskyist from beginning to end.
Yeah.
It's not super helpful. But anyhow, I bring up Plekhanov just because, like, his writings on Hegelian philosophy, on Spinoza, on the history of materialism, among other things, like, are incredibly valuable, I think. When Harrison and I wrote on Jonathan Israel and the Enlightenment, we did actually rely on Plekhanov. And yeah, I mean, he's obviously, you can only respect him up to a certain point, because again, he does get really bad after, with the Mensheviks and World War One, but a lot of that earlier stuff I think is salvageable.
What I was saying earlier about the Narodniks, it's really kind of focused my thinking on this, because if you look at the class struggle, and you're about to write on this, Doug, class struggle in the ancient world. I want you to think about this. I want you to think about what the class struggle in the ancient world looked like in terms of spirit versus the notion, because there's a difference. The rebellion in general, spirit sort of, I don't want to say blindly groping, but like the Narodniks or Shays Rebellion, I think Shays Rebellion falls into that. It's not organized scientifically, and so it falls apart, or it's based on these sort of like loose notions of what forms of rebellion will be
Sure. I mean,
effective versus not, and it's the scientific ones, the ones Lenin eventually concocted for the Russian experience, that gained fruit, and those I would argue are the moments of rebellion organized according to the notion.
well,
So,
I was going to say, with Hegel's philosophy of history, which I can understand much more than quantum, it's about the increasing amount of freedom, self-realization, self-knowledge. And, obviously there are each of these moments, like Greece, Rome, China, the Reformation, the French Revolution, all these different moments. And with like the Roman experience, and I'm going to be rereading it once I get a new translation, because I do want to check out the new translation. But anyhow, he looks at the class struggle in Greece. I'm sorry, in Rome, and I'm using class struggle deliberately. He actually says at various points, like, these Roman patricians, they act like capitalists, which is interesting. He uses that term, and he's also siding with the plebeians in these class struggles. Now, I guess it's also important to note, as far as I know, he's not taking the side of Spartacus, but he is taking the side of the plebeians against the patricians, which is an important thing to do, which is something he shares with Machiavelli, I might add, if you read the discourses. And I should add, whenever I've seen Hegel mention Machiavelli, it's always a positive mention. He
yeah,
likes Machiavelli. And also, when he talks about figures like Caesar, these world historical figures, it's
yeah.
people who are carrying out the will of history, but he's not like just celebrating them the way, say, Nietzsche would celebrate Napoleon.
Mm.
It's people who unwittingly carry it out at times, but they still carry out the will of history. And it's obviously not just this straight up linear progression, because at one point he calls history like a slaughter bench. He's not just like a celebration of like uninterrupted progress and like some vulgar caricature of an Enlightenment thinker.
Right.
So there's like looking at, like, Hegel is appreciating this, and it's also like I want to go back and look at how he's viewing like Caesar and Augustus, and how the Roman state is trying to mediate this class struggle. Because obviously that's something else that's coming up, is class struggle is never class struggle, because it's always mediated by the state.
Yeah.
and which is like why going back to Machiavelli is useful. And the thing that's interesting is like Hegel probably had less sources than we do now on Rome. So it's actually very easy to track down what he would read. It would be Tacitus, Livy, Sallust, and that's leaving aside people like Aristotle or Plato or, other
Interesting to
major
me that
philosophers.
he would characterize Spartacus as not.
I don't remember a mention of Spartacus in the philosophy of history.
Oh, okay. Well,
That's not what that's what I said. I said he's not. He's just mentioning the patricians versus the plebeians. Again, it's better that he's taking the side of the plebeians than the patricians, but still,
yeah. I looked for it and I found this today. This is the Oxford.
Yeah,
This is the Oxford version.
that's the transit I've found, and I actually experienced this directly with Machiavelli. Is the translations can differ very widely.
Yeah.
At one point, when I wrote an essay on Machiavelli like 7 or 8 years ago, and I did something like really stupid, and I was using like 3 different translations, and they were like very different. So
Yeah.
I don't have that edition. I have, well, they're not in reach, but I have the Penguin and I have another one. I don't have the Oxford. A lot of the Oxford stuff is very good. I'm reading Tacitus from whoever translated that for Oxford classes.
The Oxford one has an awful lot of like
they have a lot of explanatory notes
and footnotes. Like, go and read all of this stuff that Machiavelli read, and you'll get why he's making this and this and this is what they're saying.
I mean, I'm not that far in Livy, and there's actually a fair, like, a lot of Livy's been lost, but there's still a lot to
That
read.
kills me. How many different volumes of Livy were there?
There's at least 4 in English, so I have Early History of Rome.
Oh no! I mean, Livy was like
there was something like
hundreds of books.
There were hundreds of books. The most,
written in
like,
his
the majority are lost.
Yeah, just gone.
I know.
Library of Alexandria.
It's very upsetting. Tacitus too. A lot of these people
blame the Christians, bastards.
I'll blame them. I mean, we're lucky, like with Plato and Aristotle. It seems like most, if not all, their stuff has survived.
Some scholars say Aristotle wrote dialogues like Plato did, but those got lost.
Okay, well, I'm not super familiar with like how much of their stuff, but I actually thought most of it had survived. But
in the case of Lucretius, on the nature of things, there was only like one surviving copy of that. It was discovered in a monastery in northern Italy in the 15th century. For some reason, the monks had preserved that book, but otherwise it would have been lost.
Yeah. Unbelievable how.
Yeah, so it's like
perishable all of that was.
Like, what it's interesting to me, like just like having, particularly the last year, and believe it or not, it actually was inspired by watching I, Claudius last April, was getting all this classical literature and realizing, like, it's actually, there's not that much. Like, look at World War II. There's like 20,000-30,000 books or something on it. There's enough classical literature that it's like you can tell what everyone's drawing from when they write on it. It's like Livy, it's Tacitus, it's Appian, Herodotus, Thucydides. There's obviously archaeological stuff. I don't want to besmirch that, but in terms of written sources, there's not a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like Harrison told me at one point, you should write a biography of Spartacus. I'm like it's like there's like 30 pages of material on Spartacus. There's not enough. There's a reason why it can only be a novel.
Well, it's interesting because Doug, you of all people would probably be uniquely qualified because you have done a lot of studies on someone who is more known about, Blanqui, and who served a similar function in his society in terms of trying to organize resistance.
Sure, yeah, but also like Blanqui, even though like enough has survived. It's fairly, it's not thousands of years ago. It's only about 200. And a lot of, there's enough, like there are pictures of him, like photographs.
Yeah.
Like we have like
Well, I guess,
documentary evidence, like
well, I
in a
guess
way we don't with Spartacus.
what I mean is that like isn't some of the documentation of Spartacus actually comes from the state and how they reacted to him.
Look
The
at it this way.
The French
the
state also had similar reactions to Blanqui.
But there were also other revolutionaries. There were papers, people preserved. This is how you look at Spartacus, what survived. Imagine the only material on communism that survived was the Black Book of Communism, and you're trying to reconstruct it from that.
Yeah.
The only people who are writing on Spartacus are Roman historians, which means they're literate, they're upper class, they are not friends of the slaves, so it's literally the Black Book of Communism. They're not also interested in the same questions we would. You're not like most of the slaves probably couldn't read, at least not the ones with Spartacus. And if they did and they wrote anything, none of it survived.
This is where I think Hegel's phenomenology would come to be helpful, because the master slave dialectic and figuring out the dialectic could help you derive a bit of it for the reconstruction. It would all be theoretical.
I'm not going to write a biography of Spartacus.
Okay.
It's like, first of all, I can't do the archaeological research because that's in Italy. And second of all, there's just not enough material to do it.
Yeah.
I need written sources, or I need some kind of archaeology or archives, and they don't exist. There's questions about doing the cultural impact, and that's fine, but that's a little different. But
yeah.
No, I wouldn't. Doing Hegel on antiquity is doable since the source material is fairly identifiable what that is. Obviously, reading through it is a lot. Deciphering it, at least especially on Hegel's end, is like very hard.
Plus, an awful lot of the literature is quite literally in either German or French.
The classical sources are mostly translated.
Oh, no, I meant
And
like
with
stuff on
Hegel,
Hegel.
even like a lot of the source material I'd have to use is in English.
Okay.
Like the philosophy of history, there are multiple translations.
Right. Right.
I mean, that's going to be like my primary source is the philosophy of history.
I guess what I'm getting at is there's decades worth of discussion on Hegel in the ancient world.
Sure.
In the German context that has already been had, and it's one of my pet peeves about Anglo scholarship, and it's nothing against you or anybody else, but Anglo scholarship tends to bracket out like 9/10 of the research that's already been done and tries to reinvent the wheel as if it had never been talked about before. This is one thing that Hoolgate talks about. Like, hello, what are you guys doing over here trying to bake out the metaphysics out of Hegel, with Pippin and Pinkard and these other folks, when the metaphysics has long been like established. Like, what are you doing, guys? And the answer is monolingualism, or maybe you have one other language, and so you don't read the scholarship. Again, I'm not saying you, I'm just saying in general, the Anglo Hegel world is very narrow, and the only reason Hoolgate gets it is because he went to school reading Hegel in Germany or wherever he was, as opposed to half the other guys who maybe not. I don't know. I'm not trying to overburden your project. Don't pay any attention to me. It's just one of those things where one of these days, like, the two halves have to meet and like reconcile somehow.
If you know German or French source material, you can send it to me.
Oh,
I mean,
will.
I am starting to branch out.
Yeah,
at this point, I'm mostly looking at Hegel and the classics.
Yeah.
And eventually, I have like a list of like secondary source material as well. Between Marxists on Hegel, Hegelians on Hegel, people writing on Rome, Marxists writing on Rome.
It's it's astonishing to me how the academy breaks out classical studies, because I have a sheet somewhere from my Greek professor when I was back in Denton, and he gave me a Xerox of the reading list that he was asked to do when he went to school for classical studies, like to learn Greek, right? And how the study of Greek is sort of the material they use is either like the main sources or textbook sources, but discussing the history and um, the uses of it later, like Machiavelli, talks about the mythology of the Greek, not the Greek, the Roman. Oh, what is it? It's like, sorry, I don't want to talk out of my ass on this one. It's called like Livia's History of Rome as Exemplary History. The Renaissance myth. Here it is. The Renaissance myth of Roman antiquity and the Livian model. And
Yeah, Livy is a very patriotic guy.
yeah,
Really likes Rome. He's a lively writer. I don't want to, but I think Tacitus is far more interesting, even if he's also a very patriotic Roman. But
and yeah,
he's also very into the corruptions of power. He's like probably, it might be one of the best moralistic writers ever. He also does something I like, which he doesn't like explain everything by a fucking omen. Like all of this is like, oh, three eagles flew over the sky, so something good was going to happen to this guy. No, he doesn't talk. He does
yeah,
mention the omens, but
sales.
he's not explaining
Yeah.
everything by fucking omens. It's really annoying. Like Livy does a lot of that.
Yeah, and the Renaissance scene has a certain take on the significance of Livy and the significance of like Roman historians and how they signify like perfection. Like this is like proto blood and soil stuff in the medieval
Well, it's
era.
not just the medieval. Mussolini thought he was going to recreate the Roman Empire, modeled
Yeah,
himself on Caesar and
that's where
Augustus.
it comes from.
There's actually a book I
Twilight
want to read called,
distilled
it
it.
was by Ronald Syme, I think. I probably am not pronouncing his name, called The Roman Revolution, which he was actually inspired to write it after visiting Italy in the 30s and seeing like all the Augustan imagery that Mussolini was doing.
Yeah,
And, obviously, like, the Nazi salute, the fascist salute is, Roman. And hell, you go to like DC, it's all Roman and Greek architecture.
yes, right to the hilt. I mean, you may as well have rediscovered Albert Speer's like
But
architectural playground.
if you even read the opening of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx says, all history is class struggle, patrician versus plebeian, the common ruin of the contending classes, he's obviously invoking Rome
Yeah,
in that opening paragraph. And the fact that one of the icons of communism is Spartacus Lee, Rosa Luxemburg, that's harkening back to antiquity. And
yeah,
of course, if Trotsky and Lenin both as well are harkening back to antiquity. Tribune of the People is from a Roman
yes,
institution
yes, it
to
is.
protect the plebeians. Trotsky himself, I think his historical writing is modeled in certain respects off of Greco-Roman writers, and that's to his credit, obviously.
There's a scene in the HBO well, there are multiple scenes in the HBO Rome series in which the tribune of the people announces whatever the state's doing to the plebes, and he comes off almost as a clown, like he's almost portrayed as like a joke, like here is the third estate represented, but it's kind of a joke,
By that point, it is a joke.
yeah,
I've only seen like one episode of that show, but by the time that is happening, the Republic is breaking down.
Cicero, Caesar, Augustus, yeah,
Like it's basically just it's empty. It's like it's all these ambitious men just fighting over it. It's like its
yeah,
institutions don't work.
yeah, and whatever the bones they throw the plebes I mean, it's purely on the appearance level. Like it looks like we're doing something, but we're not.
Yeah, and it's like whenever there were serious reformers, like the Gracchi brothers, they were just killed, and other like reformers are essentially killed. Like it's like open, like
We assassinate reformers today. MLK,
yeah, and it's
Malcolm
like
X, the whole bit. Fred,
and it's like on the one hand, it's like there's a certain celebration of the Gracchi brothers in like the radical tradition. Gracchus Babu, the first modern communist. Where do you think he get his fucking name?
thank you. There it is.
But on the other hand, it's like the Gracchi brothers are not super radical. They weren't really challenging Roman imperialism, and they just wanted to like expand some rights, give more land to people, cancel some debt. But they weren't going to stop the empire at all.
They were liberals. Yeah.
they but they're obviously one of the few like reformers you can look to. There's a few others, but most of them just get knocked down.
It's the Bernie Sanders of Rome. Oh, we like this. Oh, but I want to keep my.
I mean, the thing is though, like part of Caesar's appeal is like he does like make these gestures to the people, and morons like Michael Parenti, I really hate his book.
Yes.
Like celebrate, they think Caesar was a genuine man of the people, kind of missing the point of Caesarism and Bonapartism.
Brutus was symbolically all the way, like the ancient world and even the Renaissance world understood that Brutus was the symbol of the plebes, the Junii. Okay, this was well established, and then you get up to this era.
I don't think he was. I think he was more like wanting the oligarchical republic.
Well,
he didn't like the idea of Caesar becoming king.
Right. I don't know if it was in this one, but it started to,
I mean, Brutus is celebrated in like Elizabethan England and other places for like getting rid of a tyrant.
Yeah, like I think it was in this, but hang on a second, because Brutus has actually been recoded across the centuries.
Oh yeah. Obviously, you have everything, Shakespeare and whomever.
Yeah. Oh, hang on just a second, because
and it's like, think about Mark Antony. It's like he gets like celebrated in like a lot of like popular culture, but it's like he like cut off Cicero's head and had it displayed. And that's just like one of the horrible, like I don't like Cicero that much, but still it's like the guy was like cutting off people's heads and displaying them as trophies. He really wasn't this humanitarian guy.
So here it is. Other important figures in Roman mythology played a key role in the political vocabulary employed during Machiavelli's time. Marcus Junius Brutus, the heroic figure depicted by Plutarch and immortalized by Shakespeare, known as the Second Brutus, because of his role in the assassination of Julius Caesar, the destroyer of Roman Republican liberty, was frequently invoked as a noble defender of freedom. When the Medici returned to power in 1513 and sent Machiavelli into exile and enforced retirement from politics, one of the conspirators against their return, Paolo Boscoli, was condemned for his part in an anti-Medici conspiracy that falsely implicated Machiavelli and caused him several turns on the rack. As Boscoli was about to be executed, he called out to a friend, Luca, pluck Brutus from my mind that I may pass from the world a perfect Christian. And like further down, let's see. Even works of art such as Machiavelli's bust of Brutus, further on, had to be reinterpreted to soften their political purpose. When Francesco, Grand Duke of Tuscany, acquired the bust between 1574 and 75, he added a Latin inscription to its base, which advocated the improbable thesis that Michelangelo left the work incomplete because he realized that the actions of a tyrannicide were reprehensible. Like, talk about the conservatives talking about MLK as if he's a hero in 2024 when they were all for his assassination back when he was living. Like, talk about a reversal. I mean, this is like This is like material straight out of the phenomenology. Like, uh, you know what I mean? Like, turning freedom into terror and so forth. You see how these are coextensive. Like, the way I look at Brutus today is this evil character. That's not the way he was interpreted originally. And he was
No,
and he was recoded uh, depending on who was doing the talking. It's completely arbitrary. Like, Jesus Christ.
I
But
mean, I'm all for the
it's
Gretchen Wiener's solution, which is at least my rendition of it, which is this one, is that both Brutus and Caesar actually really sucked, and we should have all celebrated the slaves.
yeah, seriously. The so like when I'm confronted, and I'm just going to say this, when I'm confronted by an example like this, Doug, it makes me look at supposedly historical figures like Jesus Christ and make me wonder, like, what was the real Jesus like Brutus versus the way this
I
grand
mean,
saw him, the way Shakespeare saw him, the way this and that saw him. Like,
what's
there's no
interesting
way of knowing. Like,
with Jesus is okay, let's leave aside all the mythological supernatural shit.
yeah,
Is I think we have a conceit looking back at it 2000 years after he died. His death is obviously very important. And we kind of like looking back for us 2000 years later, it's so important, it helps define the modern world.
right.
But not everyone, in fact, no one outside of the immediate circle in the year 30 or whatever was paying attention. It's not like the death of Caesar, because Caesar
Yeah,
is the head of Rome. People are paying attention to that. Outside of those very select circles in Palestine, no one is paying attention to what's going on. So the only people who are really remembering it at the time are his immediate disciples.
yeah,
And they're writing, and they're not writing for a while, actually. In fact, it's all oral tradition for like 30 or 40 years.
mm.
And you know how it is if you play the game at
Oh
telephone.
yeah, oh yeah,
So something is preserved orally, but how accurate it is, probably not very much. And the people who are writing those gospels, and there's not just four, there's a lot. There's a whole expanded universe that Disney cut at the Council of
yeah,
Nicaea.
yes,
But pretty much those are all interpretations of Jesus.
yeah.
I'm sorry to bust the fundamentalist bubble, but those are not like literal stories. Otherwise, I don't actually know how they make sense of the because they all contradict each other, and I don't think
They, they
the writers of the
do.
original Gospels didn't care because they thought they were just like giving their own interpretation. It wasn't a formalized canon for a long time because
Yeah,
there's the Gnostic Gospels, there's these other Gospels, and there's the what become the four canonical Gospels. So again, with Jesus, you don't have anything written for like almost two generations. There's obviously the Paul's letters, but he didn't know Jesus. He's like just, a guy who's channeling Badu or something at the time.
yeah.
But yeah, and so that's like, that
I,
makes it very hard to like reconstruct what's going on.
yeah.
Sure, you can use the Gospels as a source because they are based on like oral tradition. There's like at least three of them are using this one source called Q or Quella,
Yeah,
which has since been lost. And that's the problem with so much of ancient history is like there's so many gaps in the record.
yes.
It's like it's not like writing on Marx. It's like we have all the fucking material.
Yeah.
It's like, could you imagine like trying to reconstruct Marx like you would Jesus? It'd be horrible. You couldn't do it. He'd probably end up sounding like Bakunin or something stupid.
Well, I mean,
Read all the stuff that people project onto Paul. I mean, my God, yeah.
all the sort of sociological, like almost psychological bits that we have of Marx too, that are sort of like indirect. It would be like that. Here's the guy who went down to the pub got too drunk, stumbled home,
Right, and there are
et cetera.
Marx biographies that like try and do like some kind of pseudo biography, and most of them I don't think are very good. But
Because they try to reconstruct Marx exactly like that.
yeah. But
Whereas,
yeah, with Jesus again, it's like there's like again there's the oral tradition that was in some sense preserved in the Gospels, but it's a little different because like with Jesus, unlike say Caesar, history is not, at least for the most part, history is not constructed to like record the life of someone like Jesus.
right.
There's a reason like why Tacitus, Livy, all these people, they focus on kings, emperors, generals,
Yeah.
these larger than life leaders. And
they're
not concerned with like what's going on with the slaves or the peasants or the women, unless they happen to be royal women.
Exactly.
And even then, it's like they have to be like upstanding Romans or something.
They were able to record spirit more clearly than just the common people, just some guy off the street, some dipshit from Chicago. Like,
Sure. I mean, the thing you have to understand about the
mistakes?
writing of history
Yeah.
is most history is written, like we're talking written history, is written by people who are literate. Okay, that's probably going to disqualify like 80% of the population. You need to have time to write history. Okay, that's anyone who has to labor all the time. And that means you have a certain class bias and a class position. So you're probably going to write about, you know, powerful people. You're not going to really be concerned with what the vast majority are doing, which is why, like, when Marx comes around, and actually Hegel as well, is like this idea of actually focusing on what the lower orders are doing, on the peasants, on the workers, on the sans culottes.
No wonder Nietzsche got so pissed off.
It's very revolutionary.
Yeah.
And as much of a problem as I have with people's history is kind of one-sided, it's actually an important development, at least for agitational purposes, because most of history does not care about what ordinary people do.
Yeah.
I think we have to do like the totality class struggle from above and below. So we actually do have to be concerned with the kings, emperors, and all of them are doing, as much as we are concerned with the sans culiots and the proletariat. But that said, it's like, again, this idea of like looking at ordinary people is an incredibly modern concept when suddenly, people like Hegel, Marx, and a whole slew of other historians, as much as a problem as I have with like the mainstream communist parties, one thing they did correctly, to a certain extent anyway, was encouraging people's historians, ordinary workers, to write history of their struggles. Because that's not done. The Academy doesn't do that. It still doesn't do that, unless it's some weird pseudo postmodern crap, which no one cares about and no one reads. So whatever. But yeah. Anyhow.
Okay, it's 9:40, and we have, I think, exhausted quantum, at least up to this point. I suggest that we read for next time Remark 2, which is the employment of numerical distinction for expressing philosophical notions, or what Badiou is doing, unfortunately. And let's see how far we have to go. So it goes up to 217 and ends, and then it starts on extensive and intensive quantum, and let's see how long that is.
220.
Yeah. So why don't we read from page 212 to 220?
One maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, 221, because that gets us through to remark 1 in the next section. And that way we get the short remark, and then basically the difference in unity, not unity yet, but the difference of extensive and intensive quantum in their basic outlines. If you get lost, open your either your lectures or the EL, and it should give you a quick short summary with the class notes that'll get you through it. And unless anyone has anything more, this has been a great discussion, folks. Thank you so much.